My name is Richard Dalton and I am a partner specialising in VAT in the real estate and construction sector. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us for this BDO webinar, during which we will focus on the forthcoming introduction of the VAT, Domestic Reverse Charge for Buildings and Construction Services, often referred to by the acronym DRC. As many of you will be aware, the change was first proposed in 2017. And following consultation with various industry bodies and the publication of draft legislation and guidance, the DRC is scheduled to be introduced with effect from the 1st of October 2019. It will represent a significant change to the way in which VAT is accounted for on supplies of certain types of construction services to VAT-registered businesses. And while the change will necessitate an element of administrative change on the part of all concerned, my view is that the so what factor for this particular change to the way VAT is accounted for is its material impact on cash flow and working capital in the construction sector. I'll cover this over the course of this presentation, and I should be pleased to take any questions you may have at the end. In order to better understand the impact of this change, it may first be useful to recap on the way in which VAT currently works in the construction sector. In common with most other industries, a UK-based supplier of construction services supplying standard rated services, those that are subject to VAT at 20%, UK-based customers will currently charge and account for VAT at 20% on its supplies. In a simple supply chain, this will mean that subcontractor 1 will raise an invoice for, say, £100 plus VAT to subcontractor 2. Subcontractor 1 will declare the £20 VAT as output tax to HMRC on its VAT return for the relevant period. Assuming that subcontractor 2 is entitled to full VAT recovery on its costs, subcontractor 2 will, in turn, recover the £20 as input tax on its VAT return for the relevant period. Subcontractor 2 will then charge, say, £500 for its services to main contractor and raise an invoice to main contractor for £500 plus VAT. Subcontractor 2 will declare the £100 VAT as output tax to HMRC on its VAT return for the relevant period. Assuming that main contractor is entitled to full VAT recovery on its costs, main contractor will, in turn, recover the £100 of VAT as input tax on its VAT return for the relevant period. The main contractor will then charge, say, £1,000 for its services to the developer or end user and raise an invoice for £1,000 plus VAT. The main contractor will declare the £200 VAT as output tax to HMRC on its VAT return for the relevant period. Assuming developer is entitled to full VAT recovery on its costs, developer will, in turn, recover the £200 VAT as input tax on its VAT return for the relevant period. This is a simple process which is common in all supply chains. So what is the issue with the construction sector? The reality is that in the construction sector, the values at each stage, and therefore the corresponding VAT element, are of significantly greater magnitudes. This is a factor that HMRC believe makes the sector attractive to and vulnerable to attack from organised crime. HMRC understand that entities with low levels of VAT to reclaim, input tax, and high levels of VAT to pay, output tax, may charge VAT on sales and then fail to account for that VAT to HMRC and instead abscond with it. To put this into the context of our example, HMRC believe that subcontractor 1 could charge VAT to subcontractor 2, but instead of accounting for the VAT to HMRC, it would then retain it before disappearing as what HMRC referred to as a missing trader. HMRC intend to introduce the DRC to remove this risk. After the October 2019, suppliers of certain types of construction services will not be required to charge an account for VAT on those services. So, how will the changes impact upon the simple supply chain we discussed earlier? In the supply chain we looked at, this will mean that subcontractor 1 will raise an invoice for, say, £100 to subcontractor 2. However, subcontractor 1 will not charge and declare £20 VAT as output tax to HMRC on its VAT return for the relevant period. Rather, subcontractor 2 will include £20 as input tax and a corresponding entry of £20 output tax on the same VAT return. Assuming subcontractor 2 is entitled to full VAT recovery on its costs, subcontractor 2 will essentially be in a nil net position in respect to its purchases. Subcontractor 2 will then charge, say, £500 for its services to the main contractor and raise an invoice to the main contractor for £500. As with the previous step, subcontractor 2 will in turn not charge and account for the £100 VAT as output tax to HMRC on its VAT return for the relevant period. Main contractor will instead include £100 as input tax and a corresponding entry of £100 as output tax on its return. Again, assuming that main contractor is entitled to full VAT recovery on its costs, main contractor will be in a nil net position in respect of its inputs. Since the developer is the end user, a term we'll discuss later, it will provide the main contractor with a written confirmation of its end user status. This will enable the main contractor to then charge, say, £1,000 plus VAT for its services to the developer and raise an invoice to the developer for £1,000 plus VAT. The main contractor will declare the £200 VAT as output tax to HMRC on its VAT return for the relevant period, as it would have before, and assuming that developer is entitled to full VAT recovery on its costs, developer will in turn recover the £200 as input tax on its VAT return for the relevant period. This change achieves the desired effect of removing the risk of parties being able to charge VAT and fail to account for it to HMRC. However, it also has the potentially unintended impact of removing much needed positive cash flow and therefore working capital from the supply chain. While it is possible that subcontractor 1 is a fraudster seeking to charge VAT and fail to account for it to HMRC, in my view, it's significantly more likely that subcontractor 1 is a small or medium enterprise operating on very narrow margins. If this is the case, then the VAT that subcontractor 1 currently charges may well provide it with significant working capital, up to 20% of its turnover, between the time it receives the payment from its customer and the time that it is legally required to account for it as output tax to HMRC. To expand on that, if subcontractor 1 raises an invoice on the first day of its VAT period with payment terms of, say, 30 days, and receives the payment in line with those payment terms, then it will have access to the VAT as working capital until the VAT return and any payment is due on the 7th day of the second month after the period ends. This may well be vital working capital for subcontractor 1. The issue is then replicated for subcontractor 2, with any potential cash flow benefit of a reduction in the delay of the recovery of any input tax outweighed by the cash flow disadvantage of foregone output tax. Provided the end user has issued an end user confirmation to the main contractor should charge and account for VAT as usual. Key point to understand is which services the domestic reverse charge will relate to and how an end user is defined. The services covered by this change are broadly those services that fall under the construction industry scheme. HMRC's updated guidance issued on the 7th of June 2019 has clarified that this will include supply and fix works. For example, we now know that a joiner constructing a staircase off-site, then installing it on-site, is making a supply of reverse charge services, even if the charge for installation is only a minor element of the overall charge. Further, HMRC have stated that if there is doubt as to whether a type of work falls within the reverse charge, as long as the recipient is VAT registered and the payments are subject to the CIS, the reverse charge should apply. However, HMRC have also confirmed that the reverse charge will not apply to employment businesses who supply construction staff. HMRC see this as supplies of staff by their employer and not supplies of construction services by the workers themselves. The important distinction between supplying staff and supplying construction services from HMRC's perspective is that the individual workers are employed or paid by the employment business and not by the construction business that uses them to provide construction services. Similar situation arises where a joint venture is staffed by workers on secondment from the construction firm that owns the joint venture. Payments by the joint venture to each construction firm for their staff is not payment for construction services and therefore, as far as revenue customers are concerned, not subject to reverse charge. This seems to be a fine distinction to me, and one where I think there is scope for mistakes and potentially abuse. It is also clearly crucial to understand whether supplies of qualifying services are being made to an end user. HMRC's updated guidance states that where the customer status is not clear, the supplier should ask the customer if they are an end user or an intermediary supplier, i.e. someone connected with the end user, and keep a record of the answer. It is the responsibility of the customer to make the supplier aware that they are an end user, meaning that the reverse charge should not apply. However, in my view, HMRC have inadvertently created the possibility for errors by stating in their updated guidance that sometimes it may be obvious to that the customer is an end user. For example, if there is a repeat contract or where sales contracts are clearly set for consumer sales, so it will be acceptable to charge VAT in the normal way. I do not think that this is helpful and again creates the potential for errors or abuse. Allowing a supplier to make a decision in the absence of an end user confirmation creates a risk that services could be treated as subject to VAT when they should have been treated as subject to the reverse charge. At its most extreme, this could create a liability for the supplier who has incorrectly charged VAT to account for that VAT to HMRC, whereas the customer would not be able to recover the same amount as input tax as it would have been incorrectly charged. HMRC's guidance reiterates the fact that there will be a light touch in the first 6-month period following the implementation, provided the business is trying to comply with the legislation and has acted in good faith. However, HMRC says it may assess for errors during the light touch period, restricting penalties to cases where they believe the business is taking advantage of the measure by not applying it correctly. The guidance does not expand upon what this means, nor does it address this particular type of error, instead focusing on the potential for services as having been incorrectly treated as subject to reverse charge when provided to the end user. Where an end user has not provided written confirmation resulting in the reverse charge being applied incorrectly, HMRC will expect the customer to notify the supplier that it is an end user and request a corrected invoice. However, in the absence of an end user confirmation, the main contractor is required to treat its suppliers as subject to reverse charge, and you will see that there is a clear temptation for the end user not to issue an end user confirmation and generate a cash flow advantage for itself. The The guidance makes it clear that there is no penalty for a supplier which treats its suppliers as subject to reverse charge in the absence of an end-user confirmation. And HMRC have verbally stated that there would be no penalty for end users who fail to provide an end-user confirmation when they should have. However, this has not been confirmed in writing, and we would strongly recommend that end users do not seek to manipulate the new rules to obtain a cash flow advantage, particularly given HMRC's comments in respect of a light touch approach, as previously mentioned. In a sector where margins are tight and payment terms are fiercely negotiated, we anticipate that the reduction in working capital at all levels below the main contractor will have a significant impact throughout the supply chain. In addition to these commercial considerations, there are a number of practical aspects to bear in mind. After 1st October 2019, when supplying a service subject to the domestic reverse charge, suppliers must make a note on the invoice to make it clear that the DRC applies and that the customer is required to account for the VAT due. HMRC have suggested the wording go on the invoices. There will also be a requirement to clearly state how much VAT is due under the reverse charge, or the rate of VAT if the VAT amount cannot be shown. But that VAT should not be included in the amount charged to the customer. Where a change in circumstances mean the reverse charge treatment changes midway through a contract, the customer should notify the supplier that the end user exclusion no longer applies and charges for services in future would be subject to reverse charge. The new treatment will apply at the point the customer's circumstances changed. If this change happens during an invoice period, where there would be one invoice including both reverse charge and normal VAT rules, the supplier can opt to change to the new treatment for the entire invoice period or wait until the next invoice period before changing to the new treatment. However, in the guidance, HMRC do not appear to consider the reverse situation, i.e. the possibility that a customer could become an end user midway through the contract. For self-billing and authenticated receipts, HMRC have published transitional arrangements along with a table explaining how the VAT treatment is determined for payments due on any supplies entered into the accounting system before the 1st of October 2019, but paid on or after the 1st of October 2019. Businesses that enter into these agreements should refer to the Revenue and Customs guidance, ensure they're familiar with it. For existing, HMRC have proposed a simplification for dealing with the transition of existing contracts from the current VAT treatment to the DRC with effect from the 1st of 2019. This simplification should prove very beneficial. HMRC recommend that businesses who will be regularly submitting repayment returns as a result of no longer having to account for output tax on their services move to monthly returns, and it is likely that the flat rate scheme will no longer be beneficial for suppliers of construction services. HMRC have also confirmed that the provision of goods and services by a developer under a Section 106 agreement is not a supply for consideration, and so no VAT is chargeable on that supply. Therefore, the developer is not making onward supplies of construction services under the agreement, and so is an end user for the reverse charge purposes in respect of the reverse charge could also create other issues for operators beyond those highlighted by HMRC. For example, businesses going forward under the domestic reverse charge may be required to disclose to their suppliers whether they are, in fact, the end user, information which previously they may have not wished to disclose and which may, in effect, be commercially sensitive, therefore negating their negotiating position. To conclude, DRC will increase the administrative burden faced by businesses in the construction sector. But more importantly, it will have an ongoing impact on working capital in the sector. HMRC are aware of the risks to the supply chain posed by the impact that the DRC will have on cash flow and working capital. Their response has been to point out that there is a significant lead-in time to implementation, and therefore those affected have time to find a solution. It is not clear to me what easy solution any business would have to find an alternative source of funding equal to up to 20% of turnover. Therefore, while the main contractor will doubtless have commercial reasons for maximising its own working capital, it should nevertheless be aware of the increased stress that its subcontractors will be facing. There may be a need for main contractors to work closely with its subcontractors to agree payment terms that ensure that the risk of any negative impact from the DRC can be as closely managed as possible. I strongly recommend that any business impacted by these changes follow the position closely and seek advice on what steps they need to take to remain compliant and manage the commercial impact.